Welcome back. We started with a little discussion about how we can define conflict. Now, the book gives us a little bit more. Let's see what we think about this. Conflict begins with perception. But the real question is, at what perception level? Does conflict begin when we see someone, and only when they come into our existence do we develop conflict with them? Or does it even go back further than that to our sphere of influence, to our influences from culture, from our influences of family, through all these different influences? Perception is kind of a wide word there. So when you look at perception, we start perceiving people. It could be from watching a television show. It could be from stories that we're told growing up. It could be from the books we read. Oftentimes, people travel to America, and the only thing they know about America is what they've seen from Hollywood. And I've had people tell me that, yeah, when I got here, I expected gunfights and all this Wild West stuff that I see on Hollywood. Well, that was their beginning of perception of the American culture. And so if they didn't like how Hollywood was presenting it, it was. Conflict began at perception of Americans at that point. Involves clashes in goals and behaviors. Yes. If there's limited resources and people are stopping you, you feel, from achieving your goals, then yes, that can create conflict. If your internet provider suddenly takes away your internet, it stops you from achieving your goal of getting a great grade in this class. So you're going to have conflict with that internet provider. Also behaviors. If we're in a relationship with someone and their behavior isn't what you expect of a spouse or of a companion, then you start having conflict because they're not acting in how you feel a relationship should have that interaction. It is a process. We don't wake up automatically in conflict with someone. It can build up over time. It can start slowly. It can start fast. It can start over an incident. There are many different processes within it. It's dynamic. It's dynamic in that it's changing. We might have conflict with a person about this, but that creates conflict in another area, which creates more conflict. So it's a changing type of conflict. It's not just stagnant, Well, I'm only mad about this one thing, and that's the only reason why I have conflict with the person. Well, after you've had conflict with a person, usually you start getting more tentacles attached to it, and there's more reasons and more context behind that conflict. Within a relationship, we need to really start considering, is our conflict about the symptoms or the cause? Anyone that's been in a medical class or studied anything about medicine or watched some good, doctor shows, nurse shows, any of those things, you realize that sometimes the symptom doesn't match the cause. Are we truly mad at our spouse because they left the toothpaste lid off the toothpaste? Are we really going to get into a big fight about the dishes not being put away at 3 in the afternoon instead of 3:30 in the afternoon? You have to start realizing that sometimes irritating partner behaviors, disagreements about rules, and personality clashes can also be a symptom of a deeper problem. And for that reason, we need to step back, and when we're having conflict with someone, we need to realize that the conflict in that relationship, is that the cause of it? Is the actual cause of being mad about that toothpaste? Is that actually because you're carrying all the work in the relationship, and so that's just one little thing that adds and then takes it over the top? So you have to start looking at conflict and your reaction to it. Is it a cause or is it a symptom? If it's a cause, you can address it. Symptoms, you can run around sticking Band-Aids on them all day and still have conflict. Because once after you think you fixed it, another symptom pops up. So that's important to look at. So some of the causes: irritating behaviors, disagreements, and personality clashes. Conflict and power. In all relationship, there is a power structure. And some work well for some people in some relationships, and they don't work well for other relationships. Now, oftentimes we idealize the symmetrical relationship, where it's a 50-50, it's a partnership, and you each carry your load. In other relationships, though, oddly enough, it works out if there's a power imbalance, where someone actually wants someone to be the decision maker and someone doesn't want to have to make those choices. You know, when it comes time to go out to dinner, some couples, it's like, hey, where do you want to go? 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 In other relationships, the person says, where do you want to go? And they want the other person to say, well, we're going here and we're eating this. It works in some, it doesn't work in all relationships. So you start to realize what type of balance of power you're seeing in a relationship in order to understand the conflict you're finding within it. In our early years, we had a complementary relationship, a power imbalance between us and our parents. When do we find the conflict? When we start reaching for that symmetrical relationship with our parents, and they're not used to that. And that creates conflict. The dyadic power theory, first proposed by Boyd Rollins and Stephen Barr in 1976, and was later revised, emphasizes the relative perceived power of partners in relationships. So you have to realize it's all a matter of perspective. Okay, you might feel you have the best symmetrical relationship, it's 50-50 straight down the line, but if your partner does not feel that way, you have conflict. So you have to then realize, okay, is this one of our causes? Is this something we can address and get to the point where we share how we want our relationship to be? From the social psychological perspective, power is generally defined as the capacity to produce intended effects, the ability to influence others, and even in the face of resistance. Going back to that parent dynamic, you will go to bed at this time because I am your father. That is absolutely a case of power within a relationship. Of course, it changes when you get older. Power can be used ethically or unethically. I mean, if someone does everything you say, you can have them do good things, or you can use it and abuse it and hurt the person, stop them from achieving their goals. And power is granted. This is the hard one. Realize this, in all relationships, we give our power. Early on, we give it pretty willingly because we're a kid, we don't know anything. We just like, well, okay, you got the money, you got the car, you have the resources, so I'm going to do what you say. However, as we move on in relationships, we have to give our power away for someone to have power over us. We may have two bad choices to choose from. In a workplace, for instance, you're giving your power to your boss to set your hours. You're giving the power to the boss to determine if you need disciplined or not, and your work status and your promotions, because your other option is, I take that power back, I quit, I leave, boom. Now there are consequences, right? So power is granted, even in the most dire of situations. One individual, one book that's great to read, or one author that's wonderful to read, is Viktor Frankl. He talks about, even in the most dire situations, you still have a power of choice. That is very true. And power influences conflict, especially shifting power. When power starts to shift, there becomes more conflict because people don't want to give up what they have. So they don't want to give up that power. So that can cause additional conflict. There are currencies within this power structure. These currencies are what give people power. Going back to that job example, resource currency. Wow, Money. You know, you're going to do what your boss says. They have power over you because they're writing a check to you that allows you to do things like buy what you like, live where you want, eat what you want. So it's a resource. Expertise currency. It could be a case of a classroom. You're giving power to the professor to give you a grade because they have attended school and they have graduated, and so they have this expertise, and that expertise allows them to give a grade. That's something you've chosen to allow them to do when you enter into school. A social network currency. This we see when, I was going to end the relationship, but if I ended the relationship, I'd lose the dog. The dog is part of your social network. It's important to you. So you stay in that relationship to keep the dog or the friend or any number of social aspects of it. Personal currency. They have, if you want to be around me, you have to be in a relationship with me. And if you're not, if you don't give me power in that relationship, I leave. Well, there you go. That makes it a currency. Intimacy. Hey, I've always been there for you. When you needed a hug, I gave you a hug. And, I've always been the one you can depend upon. Now, if you don't give me power, then I'm going to take that away from you. So currency is a good way of understanding some of the dynamics within relationships and how power and conflict play out. That when currency is given, you don't have conflict. But when it's taken or it's given to someone else, you start having that conflict. So that creates the power dynamic within the relationship. With looking at the currency, with looking at the power structure within relationships, we then decide how we're going to handle conflict. And how we handle conflict can be very important to resolving that conflict. There are different methods of this. Avoidance. Avoidance is I'll just avoid all possible conflict. I'll just basically live my life dodging conflict and not asserting any power and giving all my power away. It's just not gonna work well for you. It really isn't, because we avoid conflict, and we avoid conflict as long as we possibly can, but it's still building up within us. And that's when we start chasing after those symptoms and we start losing sight of what the cause of the conflict is. Another one is accommodation. Well, I will just roll over. Anytime conflict comes along, I'll just change my stance and go with them. And accommodation is losing ourselves in many ways. And it does not really build solid relationships because the person is dehumanizing yourself. You're becoming an object. You're the yes man. You're the one that just agrees and avoids all, so you accommodate whatever the other person needs. And that's, again, giving all your power away. Competition. Well, we're in a conflict, so let's bring in friends into this conflict until I get more votes than you, and that's how we'll decide this. That's damaging to multiple relationships and creating multiple conflicts. As a friend, does your friend really like being drawn in as a deciding vote? And is it going to cost them with whoever you're arguing with? And it becomes competition. Is I'll prove myself right. I'll get more social media likes than you. Competition, very bad. Reactivity. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go along and then we're going to suddenly explode. Anytime conflict comes up, we're just going to boom. And that is a way of trying to gain power, in that the person's going to be very hesitant to address conflict with you because you're just going to blow up. That is also a negative way to try to deal with conflict, because we stop having any genuine dialogue. The person that you're having the conflict with, they might go into accommodation or avoidance mode just to deal with conflict with you. Collaboration. I win sometimes, you win, isn't the best solution. So collaboration, what you're looking for is both parties can win. You have the opportunity that I win, you win. You may not win 100% of the pie. You might only get 50% of the pie, but you're getting something. And so collaboration, you can work together. And this is how we oftentimes can find a way to deal with causes, not the symptoms within conflict. That's when we can begin to engage in that invitational rhetoric that we've talked about, where we can begin to look at the genuine dialogue, where we're not monologuing at each other. Instead, we're taking perspectives and we're looking at the situation and we're collaborating to reach the best outcome for everyone. Personality, of course, does play into how we deal with conflict. You know, are you a dominant person? Are you an influencer? Are you a person that's rather reserved, shy, and introvert? Are you very concerned about other people? Are you very concerned about yourself? So as you look at this, you can find that we kind of follow into some categories, but once again, it's like we're talking about with dominant hand and non-dominant hand. There might be situations where you are a dominant person. As a parent, you're dominant. At work, you're an influencer. And in your relationships, you're steady. So situational and dynamic, that goes back to our dynamic aspect of it. Our personalities do change and do adjust to different situations. And because of that, conflict is dynamic and can vary. But our personality in the situation, in the environment, can definitely impact the outcome of that conflict. Conflict endings. Well, there's short-term ones, where in the short term, we can separate. And this can be a very short period of time. Have you ever had a conflict where you're just like, no, I just need to step away, give me 5 minutes to go clear my head, and then we'll come back and talk? That is a short-term separation. It can be longer than that. It can be shorter than that. It can be the counting down from 10 to 0. So separation can be a short period of time. Domination. You can give in and let the other person dominate, or you can dominate. This is not a good ending for conflict. It goes back to how we're talking about the different forms. And you don't want to give all your power away within a relationship because it becomes imbalanced and you become unhappy. Compromise, you can agree on something. You can find compromise and it helps deal with the situation. It doesn't always deal with the symptom. It might deal with the cause, it might deal with the symptom. So compromise is a way. Win-win solutions, that's the one we're looking for. We're okay, we both get something out of this, but that comes back to our perspective taking. Can we view it from the other person? Can we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to have our perception changed on something? That is a way of dealing with conflict, is by being vulnerable and basically not having the power dynamic and looking for the win-win solution. Structural improvements. Well, okay, that is a good way to deal with many of the symptoms. And it can even start moving into dealing with the causes. Okay, you don't like that I leave the toothpaste lid off. So what I'll do is I'll make it part of my routine. When I open the toothpaste, I put on my toothbrush and I close it right away and put it back down. You're changing it. Or, okay, you're working later hours, so since you're not home and I'm the first person home, I'll make the dinner. And so you'll do structural improvements to make it so that the relationship dynamic is more whole for everyone involved. But what it really comes down is those long-term ones. Long-term conflicts have two choices. Either you continue the relationship or you end the relationship. There's not really an in-between. Now that separation might last a while. It could be years, it could be decades. And then you come back and you continue the relationship. Now we do need to realize that people are dynamic, they do change. So yeah, separation can lead to a continued relationship. But oftentimes it can lead to the ending of a relationship. And sometimes that is the best way to deal with conflict. However, the main thing is that you find one that makes you a better and a happier person in the end. Is continuing the relationship the one that really makes you happy, really helps you achieve your goals, and helps you be who you want to be? Or is ending the relationship that way to that goal of yours? You have to examine those for yourself. Now, there are challenges to handling conflict. We like to think of ourselves as right. We've heard that in a couple of the TED Talks. We don't like to be wrong. And so we tend to find the strengths in our argument and the faults in the arguments against us. And because of that, we need to learn to step aside and do that self-reflection. And instead of looking for the strength of our argument before going back in there and fighting more, we need to look for the weakness in it and how the strength in the other person's argument. So our self-enhancing thoughts, we tend to think of ourselves as awesome, the other person is not awesome. So we have to really deal with those. Destructive messaging. This is the one that I work with a lot of people on, people in the friends, where I make sure I don't attack them with destructive messages. I might dislike the way they did something. I might dislike something they said. That doesn't mean I dislike them. And the problem we run into is with destructive messaging, we come out and we say, I hate you. Well, that really is a great way to end a relationship. Meanwhile, if you say, I don't like what you did, you're leaving an open room for dialogue. Serial arguments. There are some relationships where this is normal. That's what this diagram is over here. Where you see an explosion, and then honeymoon, and then tension, then back to explosion. Relationships that get caught in this wheel, it's not a good wheel to be caught in. It is during the honeymoon period, it's not a bad relationship. But when the tension starts to build and the explosion occurs, wow, that really becomes a hard relationship to be in. And you can't communicate in that type of relationship because you're never sure what cycle the person's in. So when you're trying to deal with the conflict through communication, where you're trying to do that invitational rhetoric and you're trying to take their perspective, they shut you off and they shut you down. And it really becomes a bad cycle. And you can't deal with conflict within relationships in that manner, and you can't communicate across that. Whenever there's physical violence involved, for me, that's a game ender. That's where I go back to, yeah, that shouldn't be. There's no reason to ever strike out physically at a person or to be struck by an individual. So physical violence, yes. Now you can say, well, but me and my brother, we always fought it out and that's how it worked. Well, that's for your relationship, that's for you to decide. But for me, I always figure that's the line that I'm just not willing to cross. Unresolved disputes. There's always a final try. And in order to keep a relationship that you decide you wanted to keep, you need to start doing that phenomenological communication that we talked about, where we're actually trying to take the perspective of the other person. We're engaging in genuine dialogue. We're not using the destructive messages, where instead we're stating things that is based on our perception, but not targeting the other person. That's how we need to talk in that moment. As a listener, we need to make sure we make it safe for them, that we're not being imposing, that we're not sending the body language of, oh, I'm listening to respond, I'm not listening to hear, I'm just ready to attack. No, you need to set your judging aside. You need to start listening to see what their true message is, so you can move beyond this argument or this fight about the symptoms and start looking at the causes. You might not come up with a big compromise early on. Instead, find the small compromises and build your way up. Maybe you choose, okay, I'm going to do this little thing, which will help that. Start dealing with some of those symptoms to move towards the cause. But realize in the very end, sometimes the only solution is to go separate ways. And that if your communication is not reaching across all those barriers, that might be the situation. In review, we talked about managing power. Managing power kind of actually covered the entire chapter. The psychology of conflict, discrimination, conflict in relationships, how they're resolved, and what happens with unresolved ones. Because unresolved ones, they just continue in that cycle, and you have to break that. So go ahead and post down here your thoughts, your ideas, where I'm wrong, where you think the book is right, whatever you want to post. But let's have a good discussion on this. Let's keep it to the interpersonal aspect of it, because boy, when we start talking about the cultural and social aspects of conflict, boy, we need an entire chapter times 10. So I'm looking forward to reading your discussions. Thank you, and let's go for it.